Our next speaker is Daniella Wald Spielman, class of 2018. Daniella, or Danny, grew up in New York City, spent her high school years in Nashville, Tennessee, and graduated from Washington University in St. Louis in 2012, majoring in anthropology and minoring in biology. She received her master's degree in biomedical sciences at Rutgers, RWJMS, in 2013 and spent a year working in the embryology lab at Reproductive Medical Associates of New York. She is extremely passionate about women's health and is planning on pursuing a career in reproductive endocrinology and infertility. When she isn't at the hospital, studying, or working on her research project, you can find her on the tennis courts with her main squeeze, Josh. Please welcome Danny.
Dr. Paul Kalani was a neurosurgeon at Stanford University when he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. In his book, When Breath Becomes Air, Kalani offers the reader a unique opportunity to learn from his time as a medical student, experience as a doctor, and his ultimate role as the patient. Though filled with many poignant stories, there are a few that I'd like to share with you during this talk tonight. The first occurred during his time in medical school with his wife, then girlfriend Lucy, while they were studying EKGs. One night, on the sofa in my apartment, while studying the reams of wavy lines that make up EKGs, she puzzled over, then correctly identified a fatal arrhythmia. All at once it dawned on her, and she began to cry. Wherever this practice EKG had come from, the patient had not survived. The squiggly lines on that page were more than just lines. They were ventricular fibrillation deteriorating to asystole, and they could bring you to tears. Lucy had the keen insight, even as a medical student, to see beyond that practice EKG and to start to think about the patient and their story. That's what I'd like to do with you tonight. I'd like to tell you the story of a patient that weighs heavily on my mind as I complete this journey through medical school. This is the story of a 24-year-old female who presented to her gynecologist with a chief complaint of intermenstrual bleeding. On further questioning, it was discovered that she was also experiencing fatigue and weight gain and had a past medical history of PCOS. Her gynecologist sent her for an ultrasound, and a mass was discovered on her right ovary. Now, for all of us medical students in the room right now, Dr. Corbett has drilled this into our brains, so we're going to do our history and present illness right now and a differential diagnosis. So, chief complaint, intermenstrual bleeding. 24-year-old female, these associated symptoms, and a mass on her ovary. If this was step 1, the question would probably be, what's your differential diagnosis? So you'll throw on there the teratoma, the endometrioma, and the cystadenoma. And for completion's purposes, you'll probably think of some malignant neoplasms, but she's only 24 years old. If this were step 2, the question would probably be, what's the next best test? So you're thinking, okay, a mass on the ultrasound, I kind of want to see this a little more closely, so let's get some imaging. She's young, I don't want her to get a CAT scan, let's get an MRI. So that's exactly what our patient did. She went for an MRI, and her MRI was clean. They didn't see a mass. So if this is step 3, the question's probably going to read, what would you tell your patient? So 24 years old, something on an ultrasound, but nothing on an MRI. If you're following that algorithm on UpToDate, you're probably thinking, reassurance, and follow up in 6 months to 1 year. That was kind of easy, wasn't it? But what if that patient were your friend or a family member? What if you were the patient? Would you be comfortable going home? Probably not. You'd probably want to dig a little deeper. That's the exact situation I found myself in because that patient I just described was me 2 years ago. I first knew something was wrong during my first year of medical school. Like I said, I was feeling very tired and I was gaining a lot of weight despite not being very hungry. But to be honest with most of you, I thought that was the life of a medical student. It wasn't until the bleeding arrived that I realized I probably should see someone about this. So like the story goes, I saw my gynecologist, I got the ultrasound and the MRI, and I was sent home with follow-up. But something didn't seem quite right. Why was it there one day and not there the next? So I reached out to a reproductive endocrinologist for whom I had worked before entering medical school, and he told me he thought it was an endometrioma, something we included on our differential diagnosis. Now, an endometrioma is a part of your uterine lining that's growing outside of the uterine cavity. So much like the uterus, it will grow and it will shrink as it responds to hormones. That explains why they saw it one day on the ultrasound, but a few weeks later didn't see it on the MRI. But he said if I was really concerned, I could come to his office in New York City whenever I wanted, and he would scan me again, no problem. Come to his office in New York City. I was a first-year medical student. I was about to enter renal with Dr. Zackow. There was no way that I was going into New York City. So I put it off. Now here's an aside. How many of you in the room today have put off a doctor's appointment even though you knew you probably should have gone? I mean, think about your diabetic patient that you see. You're probably telling them to inject themselves 3 to 4 times a day with insulin and keep a chart of their blood glucose before and after every meal, and to follow up with you monthly. But I couldn't make it to New York City for this doctor's appointment. Think about that same diabetic patient that you prescribed diet and exercise to, but you hadn't been to the gym in months. But like most of us, I put it off. And in May, I finally went to the appointment, and he scanned me, except this time on my ultrasound, not only was the mass still there, it had grown. This is my ultrasound. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with ultrasounds, let's go through this together. This is my uterus, and this is a big, ugly mass that shouldn't be there. Within 1 hour of this ultrasound, I had an appointment with a gynecologic oncologist. And within 1 week, I was scheduled for a diagnostic laparoscopy, possible oophorectomy, possible salpingectomy. What that meant was at the age of 24, I had to prepare to lose an ovary and a tube. Now, there's almost a through-the-looking-glass experience when you're in a doctor's appointment as a medical student. I'm sitting there and I'm running through the OQPRSTs like I've been taught, and I'm saying everything he needs to know so that he doesn't need to ask me a single question, because I am that good of a medical student. I flashed back to my patient-centered medicine course with Dr. Paul Weber, and he used to always say to us, be wary of the patient that says, oh, by the way, because usually what they're about to tell you is the most important thing. So like I said, I'm sitting there, I'm running through all of it, and I keep saying to myself, just don't say, oh, by the way, just don't say, oh, by the way. And with a couple of minutes left in the appointment, he says, you didn't tell me anything about your family history. And I said, oh, by the way, I have a strong family history of gynecologic cancers. And that was the first time that I really saw that my role in that encounter was not as the medical student, but as his patient. The day that my operation arrived, I was so nervous. I mean, nervous to the point that I was hysterically crying. And hysterically crying to the point that the 65-year-old man next to me, about to have his gallbladder removed, was hysterically crying. And my anesthesiologist really wanted nothing to do with me. I don't know if it was because I was the last patient of the day, but she didn't console me. She didn't hand me tissues. She just told me she was going to give me some of the good stuff. And scared and alone, I fell asleep on the operating table. I woke up shivering in the recovery room, and my doctor came to see me, and he told me that he was able to remove the entire mass. But he saw something that concerned him. A part of my omentum was inflamed. Now, the omentum is a part of your intestines that keeps everything inside, and it lays right over your ovary. So when it gets inflamed, sometimes that can be a phenomenon known as omental caking, which is a sign of a metastatic disease. Because of that, He told me it was very important for me to go back to that reproductive endocrinologist. But this time, not for a social visit, but as his patient. So here I am the summer between my first and second year of medical school, thinking I'm gonna sit on the beach, maybe publish a couple of papers, but instead, I had to talk to my husband of a few short months about the need to freeze our embryos. Now, medical school does not prepare you to become the patient. When my IVF cycle arrived, I knew nothing about it. I couldn't tell you until I was the patient that you are injecting yourself 3 to 4 times a day to the point where you start to feel like a pincushion. I couldn't tell you until I was the patient that one of the medications, Menopur, is actually made from postmenopausal women's urine. So when you inject yourself with that, it burns. And what I couldn't tell you until I was the patient is that as your ovaries start to enlarge, they feel like 10-pound weights sitting in your belly. And what I couldn't tell you until I was the patient is that as you're injecting yourself with all these hormones, the people you love around you start to think you're going a little bit crazy. But again, the day of my operation arrived for my egg retrieval, and I found myself in the pre-op area, you guessed it, hysterically crying. Except this time, something was so different. This time, my anesthesiologist consoled me. She handed me tissues. And as I laid down on the operating table, about to get my eggs retrieved, she argued with my reproductive endocrinologist and the embryologist with whom I had worked about who got to hold my hand as I fell asleep. Finally, that summer, I felt safe in their care, and I drifted off peacefully. I awoke to the amazing news of 40 eggs retrieved, and after a week in the embryology lab, I now have 9 embryos that are enjoying their cryogenically preserved, rent-stabilized apartment on Madison Avenue. On my follow-up appointment with my gynecologic oncologist, my pathology came back as borderline cystadenocarcinoma. What that meant was that a part of my tumor had the potential to become a malignant cancer. But the biopsies were clean, the margins were clean, and so he didn't think I needed chemotherapy or radiation. He told me I was now clear for reassurance and follow-up in 6 months. As I think back to that moment, I think about Dr. Kalani when he reflects on learning about his terminal diagnosis. My life had been building potential that would now go unrealized. I had planned to do so much, and I had come so close. I was physically debilitated, my imagined future and my personal identity collapsed, and I faced the same existential quandaries my patients faced. Unlike Dr. Kalani, I wasn't facing a terminal diagnosis. I got a second chance to do what I was put here to do. And now, in my 3rd year of medical school, I am sure that I want to be a reproductive endocrinologist because I too want to hold my patients' hands as they fall asleep. And I want to save a cancer patient's dream of having their children one day. Now, I'm not saying we all have to have an operation to understand what it feels like to be the patient, but we all have the ability to imagine what that experience would be like. And there are going to be times in med school, in residency, and in life where you're tired. And seeing the 10th patient with rule-out heart attack when you know it's just acid reflux is the last thing you want to do. But I hope that you always take this quote with you from Dr. Kalani towards the end of his life and the end of his memoir. In that moment, all my occasions of dialed empathy came rushing back to me. The times I had pushed discharge over patients' worries, ignored patients' pains when other demands pressed, the people whose suffering I saw, noted, and neatly packaged into various diagnoses, the significance of which I failed to recognize. Let's not fail to recognize the significance today. If you take anything away from my talk, it shouldn't be about the horrible experience I had 2 years ago, but it should be these 2 key points. The first, always make your health a priority. We all have the amazing ability to be in the healthcare profession, but only as long as we remain healthy ourselves. Never put off your doctor's appointments, and don't save that diet and exercise till next year's New Year's resolution. The second, I hope you always remember the story of the two anesthesiologists, and as you progress in your careers, reflect on which one you want to be like. And I hope you all agree that you'd like to be like the second one, and treat every patient as if they deserve to have their hands held. No amount of medical training prepares you to become the patient. It's not something we're regularly taught. But we are taught the tools to diagnose and to treat. So take those tools and take a moment to journey through your own looking glass before you see every patient. And with that, you'll become a better patient-centered physician. Thank you.